Okay, looks like we're live. Hey, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Open Web Foundry. I'm really excited to have you on. You are essentially the king of DAOs, I think, at this point. No, it's true.
Really.
Like you were doing this way back when it was. I was going to say before it was cool. I'm still not sure that DAOs have had their moment. Like I think there'll be the wave after NFTs, but yeah, you were certainly here doing this, like, and thinking about all the associated questions for a long time. So that's, yeah, amazing. Very glad to have you joining us this morning. Or for you, I assume, in the middle of the night.
Yeah. I mean, like, I had nothing else to do and couldn't, get employed in space. So, I ended up in the line of DAOs. So, yeah.
Okay. Maybe that's a good segue into the start of the story. So how did this start with you? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be honest, I never really cared so much about DAOs until I think, I was applying for one and I was rejected, right? So I think a lot of the origins of, like, we think about DAOs in space and everyone knows about the DAO, right? Of course, at $150 million, and it was hacked, and we never really saw it, like, spread its wings. I would say the first DAO that was really operational within the space was, Moloch DAO, right? And that was basically this MVP of a DAO created by Amin Soleimani and, like, some other folks within the core Ethereum ecosystem, right? And the innovation with Moloch was that, it was a very, very simple design focused purely on giving out grants, as in distributing capital and funding, right? And it had this feature called Rage Quit where, people could basically join the DAO with very little risk because they could leave at any time. And yeah, I would call this a 4-minute mile because, of DAOs, because all the DAOs before were it was all very theoretical. Everyone was thinking about DAOs, no one executed on it. But, Moloch, they just grounded the whole idea into something very useful from day one. I wanted to join because I wanted to learn more and I had nothing else better to do. But apparently you had to put up at least, $20,000, 100 ETH back then, and also be known in the space. So, having none of both, I was rejected. And, I think Amin in the postmortem, like, we had a call afterwards, he was like, why don't you fork it, right? And, that's where, I was like, why not? Right? It's a bit of a joke. And the joke was kind of like, hey, first ever person to be ever rejected, from joining Moloch. So, and from that joke, it kind of became a bit more serious as people realized, I guess, me and a few other people within the metacultural community realized that, people really wanted to experiment with DAOs. So we wanted to, kind of create a new DAO, fork it, but, instead of, like, doing grants and giving out grants for core ETH2 development, right? We wanted to really, like, foster a dApp builder community on the application layer of Ethereum. So this was, like, early 2019 where, no one was building products for end users, or no one was thinking about use cases. No one was terribly thinking, like, deep about, like, say, user experience, right? So, we were a bit worried about that. So yeah, that's what we decided to build.
Right. Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay. So it's been quite a while since then. It feels like yesterday in some sense, yet evidently it's been like almost 2 years at this point. And there've been a lot of iterations on the DAO construct since that time. And I think maybe for our community that are sort of new to this, it might not even be clear that what we now call a profit sharing community in the back end is actually really just a decentralized autonomous organization, like a DAO in a similar form to Metacartel, and then also the ventures arm now. But obviously with this profit sharing component where you're basically giving dividends every time someone uses the service to members of the DAO. Yeah, that's one of the iterations that's out there. But I'm curious to hear, like, your thoughts on other iterations that are making the rounds. Like, of course, you've got Metacartel Ventures now, which has a fairly different structure, if I understand correctly, to Metacartel DAO proper, or the grants vehicle.
Yeah, there's many different, like, sort of implementations of DAOs, right? But I think the whole essence of, like, this idea of what a DAO is, right, is I think it's a Web3 native term, right, that describes the idea that sort of like organizations and products or platforms and networks, right, are sort of like community owned and run. So in traditional web, right, and for the last 20, 30 years in tech, it's all been about, like, keeping as much control as you can over one central company. And then usually how people make money from that is, they get investors, they pump up, the metrics and revenue, they seek growth unsustainably, and they try to IPO that, right? And like as opposed to that sort of like model we've seen in Silicon Valley for the last 30, 40 years, right? With Web3, it's all about creating I guess networks of people that collectively own networks that are much more distributed. So the game here with Web3 DAOs in general, right, is that how can you create the most valuable community, and how can you distribute the ownership to those creating the most value for that specific community, right? So in this, and sort of like this implies certain properties, such as like when you hold tokens, you're effectively this network owner, right? You're owner or DAO or community member of this like organization, and you have different rights, such as rights to revenues, dividends, whatever you want to define it, or like voting rights, and you get to govern and have a say in like the future of where the project's going. That's I think like sort of the core essence of what a DAO is. And throughout Ethereum, like since Ethereum like emerged, there's been a lot of tokens, right? But it's in my mindset, it's like they've all been like sort of attempts at like figuring out what is a DAO, how should it be run, how do you launch these, right? And only I think maybe over the last 18 months have you seen sort of like greater development and like like small signs of maturity over like realizing that DAOs need to be more than just sort of like these instruments of speculation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like I think we're definitely moving in the right direction at a faster pace than previously. But you could also argue that really the history of DAOs goes back to like the birth of Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin is essentially just a proof of work DAO, right? Like you just take part in the voting by, randomly guessing numbers basically. But like it's the same sort of structure. It's just in a very primitive form relative to what we have today. And what was really cool, I thought, about the DeFi explosion over the summer, was that like at the core of each of these protocols, they were taking a serious attempt at governance DAOs, which was not the case previously with like the 2017 batch of projects. Typically, even if they were built like you're putting aside the layer ones, which basically have like Bitcoin like governance system, DAO system. Even putting aside the layer ones, the layer twos were not really very committed to decentralized governance of any form. Yet over the summer, we saw DeFi pop up in this like fairly serious way, building on top of the DAO structure. That was pretty neat. Which of the experiments there are you following the most, and what would you say is like the takeaway, if there is any at this point, of that move?
Yeah, takeaways. It's a good point. I think, at least how before I even go to takeaways, how I think of it is sort of like you have, Bitcoin is a great example of like a DAO technically, right? It's it's this network and organization that's purely driven by incentives, right? You mine, you provide hash power, you secure the network, you get rewarded, right? And this is sort of like this is the design of the network. And I would kind of consider Bitcoin as a network that doesn't require a lot of human input, for it to specifically run. Like, sure, yes, core development, core clients, they need to kind of sync up and actually work together. But
actually,
right, not much, right? Yeah. It's kind of set and forget. But sort of like as we see, like usually like the lower you go in terms of the technology stack, the more it seems like you can the goal is to kind of like create really important piece of infrastructure and set and forget and sort of like protect like sort of the special like interests and rights of like the project, right? Mm-hmm. But as you kind of go up the stack, right, when you go to say infrastructure, middleware, infrastructure, even like sort of applications, right? You kind of like it seems like you need like greater like community and like human input effectively into like how the projects run, right? And this is sort of like the governance styles that you're really talking about, I think. And from 2017, everyone realized that it's really hard to build a community when the sort of like the token that's supposed to bind the community is instrument speculation. And the reason why that is because it's sort of like it's really hard to build trust in the community when it's so transactional, right? So the entire communities of like token holders back then were pretty much everyone who wanted to get rich quick, and without actually participating in the network, right? So in this last cycle, I think we've seen a greater focus on actually curating who and very, and thinking quite a lot more about how do tokens end up in the hands of people? Who should those people be, and why? And basically rewarding the right people, right? So in these networks, when we talked about like distributing sort of ownership, right? Like how do you do that, right? So you have kind of like sort of two means to do that. You kind of have like programmatic distribution mechanisms, right? So sort of like set and forget, or like if this and that sort of rule-based distributions, right? So and this is like kind of applied to different things, right, in space, such as like, let's say you have this lending protocol. The lending protocol needs to bootstrap liquidity. So maybe one of the programmatic ways to distribute ownership is to distribute ownership to those who provide capital for liquidity, right?
Yeah.
Maybe even like whoever answers most questions on Discord or Discourse, right? That through source credit, something like that. And this sort of like mechanism is fairly efficient. It's very quick, it's lightweight, right? But the downside drawbacks is that it's not terribly it lacks the sort of like human nuance that
Right.
represent communities, right? Because it's more than just it's more than who just brings capital, and it's more than numbers, right? It's about people. So that's where you have sort of like manual distribution and of like the ownership of the network, and this is sort of through like say hackathons, grant programs, bounties, and sort of things like this that require human input for the ownership of the network to be distributed.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Yeah, certainly. Like there was this question back in 2017, 2018, the guiding ethos was more is better in terms of people like staked into your DAO, and back then they were like this primitive sort of base layer DAOs, that kind of thing. But like it seems the space very quickly moved away from that when the sort of when exchange type would you say? Yeah, when the hyper speculatively focused hordes started causing problems for the projects that are associated with it seems like the revision is now, okay, fewer people might be better. You just got to pick the people to be stakeholders early in a more sane way. That's really interesting because it leads to this question of like, how exactly do you do that without it becoming a biased, actually pretty centralized, maybe even nepotistic type system where we're all just like, well, as you got rejected from Moloch because you weren't known in the space, right? So like how do we get around that question of stopping it becoming an echo chamber and that type of thing, where it's really just focused on the friends of the people that are the earliest supporters or founders?
It's a really good question. I don't think we've really like answered this. And in a way, like like a like attracts, right? So this is like sort of like, I think the level of diversity you want in your like community. I think it really depends on the sort of ethic and values you have, right? So I do think it's like an active effort in preventing that. I do think that naturally sort of communities self-select and self-attract people that are like themselves, right? So the first 50 people of a community, like whatever they look like, right, they're going to really attract similar people to that community. So the next like 200-300 people will probably look like a lot like the core 50 people, right? That's why like sort of like making sure you foster the right sort of culture and attract the right people at the early stages is important, and you can make the most amount of impact that I think early on. So if you want to really focus on getting diverse crowd in, a lot of that work is done with the first 50 people, right? And kind of beyond that, it's left for, the curation of the communities is really left to its own members and whoever is attracted to the community, right? And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because effectively, like Web3, in my opinion, is all about like, it's all about going out and creating like new networks, right? New networks that reflect our own set of values, and we're not always going to share the same values. We're not going to always share the same missions and sort of like goals here. So it's all about picking the right one that you like, and contributing to that, right, and pushing that forward, or creating a new one. We kind of have this freedom now.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. I think the problem is going to come when these things get really large. So when the incentive to take part in DAOs becomes like one of those things, kind of like NFTs right now, where it's a hot market, and so anyone taking part is having lots of money land in their lap. Then it's going to be hard for the values to remain the guiding force. And there's also this question of like, do you know the eternal September phenomenon?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this problem, for anyone that's watching that isn't aware. Basically, the principle is that, or at least the story, I don't know how true it actually is, but the effect is true, regardless of whether the origin story is true. It used to be that, people would start using the internet when they came to college. And so the freshmen each year would come along in September, and they wouldn't have any idea how the culture worked. And they would start kind of, frankly, shit posting all over the mailing lists. And it was just annoying for everyone that was like a seasoned part of the community for like this 10-year period. But after September, October would come, and they would start to get like an understanding of how they should actually act in the community. And then, by November, sort of everything was normalized. But then along came the September of, I think it was 1992, where the number of people joining the internet at a certain, in like a small period of time was so large that essentially the entire culture of the network was lost. Because, there were just so many people without the, would you say, like the understanding of how the community decided that they should all act, joining at once, that the old people were drowned out by the new people. And then suddenly, well, I guess this kind of led us down the path to where the internet is today, which is some kind of, what's hard to describe as sort of this mayhem. It would probably be a reasonable word for it. I wonder whether there's that danger with some DAOs as these things grow larger as well. Like eventually we're going to reach a point where Arweave has so many supporters and it's like clearly on the path to beating, Dropbox, that like now there's just so many people excited to get involved that like, and sure enough, you can just go onto Verto and buy Arweave tokens, right? You wonder how the DAOs are going to deal with that problem if it arises. And it looks like it probably will arise.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's like, there's going to be a flood of people as, each community grows. How do you deal with sort of that growing audience within communities, right? There's different approaches here. Like one simple approach is to limit the community, but like for certain DAOs in space, they've limited memberships up to a certain point. Right. That's one solution. It's probably not going to work for most people, right? And most communities. So there are DAOs within DeFi where there are like tens of sort of like contributors, but then how they've organized themselves is through sort of like these working groups where effectively like it is what it is. Like as community, it's really hard to coordinate a large this monolithic group of people to execute and work and collaborate, right? Usually what you tend to need to do is break things down into smaller, more manageable groups. And that's what most DAOs are doing today. And this is sort of part of the curation process where it's not about like excluding people because like you don't have any tokens, but rather excluding people based on sort of like other properties such as like, do you contribute to the DAO in any sort of meaningful way, right? So you form working groups where, over time, you curate like sort of meaningful contributors into them, right? So, there's this sort of rule in the internet where it's like, the rule of the 99 and 1, where basically it's like 90% of the internet are purely passive, right? 90% are like, light contributors, and 1% of the internet, are the ones that truly like, do the heavy lifting. And, one example is like a large proportion of the top 20 Reddits are like moderated by a very small amount of people.
Right. Yeah.
And this sort of thing applies. So generally when you scale, right, the way to organize is really like curating your set of values. Like if you value sort of, if you have like, say, I think most communities probably have a value around, meritocracy, right? Like kind of like, valuing like doing things over like just passive, like talking, right? If you value that, you might want to start curating, subgroups of the community that get shit done effectively, right? That's sort of like what most communities have been doing, and it works fairly naturally. Like, to be committed to an online community or to these DAOs and actively contribute, it definitely requires like a level of dedication that naturally filters out, like the crowd or or sort of more passive sort of community members.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we certainly see this in the DAO of Arweave. Like nowadays, we have a sort of naturally occurring working group on gateways, a naturally occurring working group on like atomic NFT standards, and another one spinning up on the Arweave wiki. And it's all, you kind of see it, this recurring pattern where basically a small group or small subset of the DAO that are interested in one particular topic decide to work on something together, and they end up actually forming like a private collective, for better or worse. It's an interesting pattern. It's tough to see how that changes and works over time. Like to some extent, you don't want it to be in private. You want like these to be in public channels. So like the atomic NFT standard people, they started discussing in public rather than in private channel, because actually there were so many people that Discord couldn't support the number in the private chat. So they moved to public. But I think in some strange way, moving to public actually sort of stopped them. They seemed to lose steam when they did so, interestingly.
Right.
Which, yeah, like to some extent, like having these private groups allows people to really be bought into the thing they're doing. And then having it be public is like, well, I don't know, man, there's like 60,000 Arweave token holders. Why?
Yeah, I mean, it matters.
One other of these people.
Because, you know, when you kind of like share a context, like you share like a close context with people, other, like, you know, small group of others, it's very easy to trust each other's. You know, you're able to share ideas much more freely. You're able to speak freely without sort of any consequence of like, you know, judgment, right? And it's psychologically safe, right? So this is like very important for communities. It's like it's very important to create this like environment where people are willing to, you know, fail, you know, have weird ideas, bring up things, you know, that they're uncomfortable with. And this sort of space, you know, needs to be sort of guarded and, you know, gatekept to some extent, right? Like it can't be a public group, but you also need the right people in the group, and I need a way for the right people to join, right? So this is sort of the curation process, and oftentimes it's like, you know, if someone else were to come and say contribute to a GitHub repo related to one of the standards, right? They'd probably be quickly noticed, and you know, someone might want to reach out
to the group. That's typically what happens.
Right, yeah,
absolutely.
So sort of that like environment's quite important to protect, and you know, at times, you know, yeah, there's like discussions that, you know, can be brought to the public, but this is why I think, you know, sort of these like decisions are really, you know, generally should be like really driven by the communities themselves in these groups, and you know, typically, you know, it's this sort of discussion of like, you know, what should we discuss in public? What are we comfortable with? And etc.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, it's almost like a kaleidoscope in effect to some extent. Like you have this, we're all arguably in the crypto ecosystem, and then we're all sort of in the Arweave DAO, which is growing. And then as it grows, the number of people that are, the number of people that are taking part in the individual sub-activities are sort of coalescing into their own sub-DAOs. And one of those could arguably be Verto, for example. And then inside Verto, there was this other sub-DAO, which was talking about like Rconnect and how to build the standard between Arweave.js and the Rconnect web extension. Like how should that work? It just occurred to me that there's actually like this nested structure to it all. And it seems like the bigger the DAO gets on the outside, the more likely you are to have the coalescing of subgroups. It's kind of interesting. Okay, anyway, back to the core point, which is like, all right, so a lot of the people watching here are in the early stages of building profit-sharing communities. And so part of that is building a product or a protocol or a mixture that, you know, captures profit somehow when users use it, basically, and distributes that to owners of the DAO. This is the stage that a lot of the people in the Foundry are at the moment. They have this kind of idea set. They're maybe on the way to building an MVP, just about shipped an MVP, something like that. But now comes the question, well, how do they actually take part, or how do they, would you say, take the first few steps to creating a community around their, you could say like filling out the DAO around their application. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
That's a good question. And I think, you know, usually like, you know, when we, you know, when we apply these DAOs, you know, talk about DAOs again, it's like, you know, how I kind of think of them is that, you know, the communities that kind of run and operate these sort of like projects over time, right? It's like DAOs are sort of like open source and steroids, applied to entire organizations. So it's no longer code; it's entire open source organizations, right?
Exactly. Yes.
With this sort of in mind, right? You're kind of like building this sort of clubhouse for people to come and like work on the project with, right? So I think it depends who you want to track. Do you want to track sort of there's different people that need to like that belong to sort of this like each community, right? Like builders, writers, designers, devs, engineers, etc. And you even have like investors. You even have say other community members from the ecosystem, right? So you have all these participants that make up like of what you kind of really need to run this project. And oftentimes, like the question of like in terms of how do you build this community is really another way to think about it is why should people care about this project and why should people contribute? And that comes down to really like I think really like getting clear on like why you're working on this, because and what you're trying to achieve, and it's really about like communicating that so that others can recognize whether that's something they want to also like contribute and work towards, sure, right? So sort of like clarifying the mission of the project, what does success look like, where you're right now, who else, what sort of help do you need, right? And sort of how you want to execute this vision and what matters to you. So it's just sort of like the values that you have, right? And like as a small team, typically in a startup, right? Like these may not like working in a 2-person team. Like, look, it could just seem like a waste of time, right? To talk about these things, before you even launch a product. But on the flip side, that's very, very important. That's what people think about when they look at other projects, right? And that's what when someone decides to contribute, it's most likely not because sort of you're building the most amazing tech in the beginning, but most likely you have this sort of vision and a mission that really matters,
right.
And you're doing it in a way that resonates, right?
Yeah, for sure. We've certainly seen this in Arweave, like back at the beginning, our early community in like September 2017, that type of thing. These people were like, we had an awful website at the time. It's absolutely atrocious marketing. It's like way too much information, way too technical, and also just not really communicating the point that well. But the people that were attracted to it at the time were like, hey, actually the mission here is really cool. Like, let's rebuild the Library of Alexandria, but in the technical age, so we can do it like 100 or 1,000 times better. Yeah, they were attracted by that. And even around the early profit sharing community ecosystem, you can kind of see that. Like a lot of the tech back then was pretty, let's say it was early stage. This was only 6 months ago, and it's still pretty early stage now, relatively at least. But like you could see people were really attached to this idea of, oh wait, it would be awesome if we could do this thing, like have fairer startups that are actually distributing their profit to stakeholders, ... And those people end up contributing amazing things, like back to the Verto team and building Arconnect. Like the community did not have a good MetaMask equivalent. And so some team from the community, Verto, they just end up like going and building it. And that's just incredible. But that only happened because we focused on like community building rather than necessarily even the technical building. I would argue that a strong community is more valuable than a huge amount of tech, because the community will build the tech to follow the mission over time. And I'm sure that's true for like, second layer stuff building on top, as well as like Limestone just recently had this, someone was using Limestone, which is like a kind of data provider, essentially Oracle system on top of Arweave. They were using it, it doesn't have a huge number of feeds, doesn't have a huge number of stakers right now. It's pretty early stage. But they were using it for something, and then they decided to just build like a Limestone JS library that anyone can import and use. And now Jacob, the guy that founded Limestone, didn't have to do anything, and suddenly his project is like 50% more helpful to people, which I just think is like super, super cool. And it speaks to the power of these communities. But yeah, okay, cool. So at the beginning, there's this stage that the founders are at, right? Where they've got like, we've got a mission, we've got a product, we got like an early team, maybe like founders plus one or two more, something like that. But they have to go about practically trying to build the community for the first time. So, it's a little bit tactical.
What does that mean, right?
Exactly. What does that mean? What do you do precisely? and I have some thoughts on it, but I'm keen to hear yours. And yeah, we can just like explore the idea, because I think that's the stage. You know, a lot of these ideas are a bit wishy-washy.
Right, exactly.
It would be helpful to people, I think, if we were just like concrete about, hey, here's an
Yeah.
idea that you can go and execute.
Yeah, I mean, talk to talk to everyone and anyone you can. Well, maybe not to that extent,
Nice.
but that's sort of what I did for a lot of my community building efforts with Metacartel. It was, you know, we were trying to build this sort of general community around DApp builders and then, you know, fund DApp creators, right? When we're trying to get this up and running, right, fundraise and so on, I really just talked to anyone that was relevant, DApp creators, investors, anyone in the community that would listen, right? That could help improve like the mission and maybe support these dApps. And, you know, a lot of, to be honest, like community building is a lot of recruiting, right? In the sense that you're just going out there, reaching out to people and, you know, trying to like share like what you're working on and why you're doing so. And, you know, if they can support or contribute in any way, like maybe sometimes, you know, they'll surprise you and actually come through, right? So it's definitely like getting a project out there, and sort of the easiest way forward, I think, is just to, you know, message people, you know, that are, you know, that might find your project interesting, right? So if I was building something in the Arweave ecosystem, I have an idea, right? I might, you know, the first thing I might do is sort of like write it up, maybe even create some mock-ups, or I might have it like an MVP. And I think, you know, I would probably just go approach, you know, other people building Arweave projects, get feedback, right? Maybe even like see if you can collaborate with some others, right? And then sort of like create a community space where others can like follow your work, right? And that's where you start, you know, like fostering these sort of relationships with others. And, you know, it goes from like, you know, learning about your project to, you know, watching your progress and realizing, hey, this train isn't slowing down, right? To maybe even like, you know, answering one or two of your needs. Maybe it's like, you know, they start contributing, like you have some sort of like technical problem that you need help solving, or, you know, etc. And maybe they contribute in small ways, but over time you sort of like, you build this relationship, right? That, you know, that grows in trust. And, you know, it's sort of like this, you know, doing this with like tens, if not hundreds of people, right? And, you know, sometimes you know, you'll just, you know, find the right people who have the right capacity of time to contribute, who align with your vision or resonate with sort of what you're building. And, you know, they might just jump in and like help out, right? And that's sort of like the start of like this like contributed community, right? So it's definitely sort of a grind, and of just, you know, learning about others and having others learn about your project and yourself and so on.
That makes total sense. I think in the Arweave community, what people tend to do is they post about their idea or something in the Arweave dev Discord, which at least used to be the main focal point of the community, but now we see, you know, the DAOs got so large, it's splitting into sub DAOs, and so we see less activity in the main Discord and more in these sub ones. But yeah, if you start talking to a few people there about the idea, and then you spin up your own Discord, then you naturally start collating the people that are interested in the idea. And I see like a few of the profit sharing communities that are very, very small in terms of member counts have really, really high engagement, because they haven't like tried to push it in people's faces that, hey, you should join our thing, blah, 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 we're going to be really big or anything like this. They just said, yeah, we're working on this thing. And then the people that are like excited to explore the rabbit hole of Arweave, if you will, they kind of naturally find their way into this little Discord server somewhere, where the engagement is really high. Like, I think the Amplified Discord probably only has 50 people in it, and I'd say about 20 of those are active contributors, which is like crazy ratio. And then amazing things start to happen. So I definitely think that's one route. And yeah, and then after you have that, it's just a case of like going out and speaking to the people you think might be relevant, sort of exploring the social graph while also bringing people back to this little pocket of the internet that you've started. And then go on.
I mean, on that note, do we have like this week in Arweave, or like
well,
sort of like,
yeah, so we have this weekly thread that the Weaver does on Twitter, which is really helpful, kind of collating all of the activity that's happening in the ecosystem. And there's also Arweave News. Is Arweave News Guy, I think he calls himself. Are you here? Normally it shows up to these things. Anyway, yeah, so we have our own news service, which is really amazing. And this is one of those things that, like, if you just focus on collating the right community, then you get a news service, and it just kind of naturally emerges, and it's independent and it runs itself, which is just incredible. So definitely pays off in the end. Okay, interesting. So I think what might make sense at this point is if we actually go talk to the community in the Gather town. Is there anything else you want to say before we get there? I think there's one question we saw here, and someone said something. So okay, yeah. Before we move to that, I guess, what's the best ownership for private collectives? What do you think about steward ownership reasonable model? So I think they're saying like reasonable models for owners by the stewards, ownership by the stewards of the community, if I'm interpreting the question correctly.
Right. I think like the question is sort of like, what percentage of the network should, core contributors own or do it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is going to be really different for every community, right? So, and usually I think, how you discover that right number is, by talking to, getting feedback from all the community members. You sort of like figure out what's fair. Right? So, you can justify, say, hey, we're launching this network and it's worth this amount at the start. At least that's what we think it would be, right? As so we pre-allocated a portion to contributors so far because they've worked X amount of hours, they've done this much, and we're allocating a future portion to developers/creators, right? And we think that's important because of long-term alignment, right? And you sort of like justify this sort of in these means, and I think you sort of want to just get lots of feedback, right? You create an open discussion about this. And sort of, I think definitely, while early on, you don't need to make this like, you don't need to like figure out this in complete, like in total, right? You don't have to land on some concrete, I think it's totally fine to like start a conversation about this, right? And because, when it's definitely something else when, contributors come in with the expectations of like, contributing and receiving like a future stake in the network. It's definitely a lot more motivating in that sense versus just like, maybe contributing, to open source project, that, may or may not like kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. It's arguably the secret weapon of Web3 is this ability to give people ownership relative to their contribution to the network. But it also begs this question of like, again, in practice, not in theory, how does that actually work? How do you do it? I mean, for what it's worth, from the founders I've seen, basically you just have to go to the market with an idea, and then the market will tell you that you're wrong about 100 times, and then eventually you fashion the table into something that everyone can accept. So there's a lot of hit and miss with it, I think, or at least that was certainly the case for us and for the founders I've seen in the community so far, and we've sort of guided through the process of fundraising. That seems to be the case. They'll have an idea and then they'll get some feedback, and it's like knock it this way, knock it that way, until you slowly like chisel the right cat table, I guess. Okay, cool. And there was one question about why not create blind gatekeepers? You have to prove yourself as worthy, but the gatekeepers don't know anything about you, but what you provide as proof, document describing something, code, etc. And if you pass the gatekeeper, you become one. Put in your time, then you get into the internal part of the DAO. It's an interesting system.
Yeah, pretty much. You just explained, sort of how a lot of these DAOs work, right? It's sort of like, trial by contribution.
Right. Yeah, I think trial by gatekeeping is probably not the right move, because you want people to be sort of indoctrinated into the set of values of the community, and then go out to check for more people that understand the values of the community. But broadly, the principle sounds right. Yeah,
you can determine that case by case, right, with each community. Like some communities, like it, may value like values alignment a lot more than the work you bring, and then vice versa. You can, you could figure this out, change it, make it up, alter it, iterate over time, right? So it's sort of like it's a process you kind of have to work on.
Right. And I think there's some truth to the fact that trust minimized systems have the eternal September problem in much smaller quantities. And so that's a real protective value. Like Bitcoin, created by cypherpunks, then arguably sort of surrounded by people attempting to get rich quickly during like 3 or 4 cycles so far. But it doesn't matter
Right,
for
exactly.
for the future of the protocol, because the protocol is so like embedded and the rules are so strong that it doesn't really matter what the people around it want. The protocol is going its own way. So certainly trust minimization is one way you can sort of ensure that your protocol or your community over a long period of time sort of moves towards a set of values. But to some extent, it's easier in some cases than others. Like Bitcoin has a fairly simple system relative to a lot of the DAOs we see nowadays. So it can be enforced without human intervention. But it's not clear that, like, I have no idea how Meta Cartel would have done that, for example.
Yeah, definitely. It's sort of like we go back to the different ways of distributing ownership, right?
Yeah.
And you have to really like be careful and protect the process of distributing that ownership. So, you know, for Bitcoin, how you distribute it, right? The rules are set, so you can't really mess with that. But for sort of these DAOs that are still like in progress modes, right? It's very important to, you know, sort of like make sure the right people are stewarding sort of like how the network is distributed, right? So, you know, and in the future, once it's maybe the network is close to being fully distributed, you know, at a very at a later stage, right? Maybe sort of like, califying the rules might actually not be a bad thing, right? You know, like some DAOs actually, you know, intend to be a DAO for a period of time before they fully shut down governance, right?
Interesting.
Like systems like Reflexer, where they kind of do need sort of, you know, human governance and human stewardship and sort of nuance like leadership in the beginning, but they, you know, but over time they plan to really like fully, remove human input from the system, right? And you know that's sort of like you're making sure like the ship's like sailing in the right direction, making sure there's no holes in it, and like them pushing it off, right?
Right.
Yeah. So governance it's not like a permanent thing at state of affairs. True, you can, you know, design it to be shut down.
I mean, that's that's absolutely true. Like governance is there to some extent handle the mutable parts of the system, and part of the mutable part of the system can be the governance itself. You can get rid of it, and it feels like a lot of the base level protocols, like Ethereum is not doing this very quickly or very well, I would say, frankly. As much as I appreciate the values and I appreciate what they've done for the space and all the rest of it, it's pretty clear that Ethereum shall be led by this fairly small group of people, and they they decide the inflation rate, they decide the technical upgrades and all of this in a very, very centralized way. But it certainly seems like the way that we should be heading with base layer protocols, and this is definitely what we're trying to do with Arweave, is like the governance shall step back over time, and we just end up normal participants in the network. And I imagine that's probably true for some of the profit sharing communities out there as well. Like they should reach a point where, I mean, it's very clear if you look at the adoption cycles of typical Web 2 tech, like Airbnb, YouTube, Reddit, just to name 3. Like you saw that they had this process of innovation at the beginning. Then they built a product that had a product market fit. People liked the meme. They used it. It spread. And it was kind of self-reinforcing in one way or another, like network effects or what have you. And then basically, Reddit and Airbnb and YouTube, they don't change anything anymore. So from the point of view of a profit-sharing community, if they got to that stage, you could be, as the founders of that, you should be thinking about, well, how do I just make this kind of cemented in place? It does its one thing very well. And then the community can participate and come in and out as they like. And the governance or the sub-governance structures are there. So like on Decentralized, for example, each of the communities can govern themselves. So, moderate their own content, basically. How can I get those things stapled in place and then leave the rest to be an open protocol, essentially? But this is another conversation. Maybe we should move it to GatherTown. Thanks so much for your time, Peter.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
All right. See you all in GatherTown. Bye, guys.